Well, when I originally set out on this project to revamp the suspension on my Opel Manta, you could say the suspension is in shocking condition. I originally thought I would do the front first and get it all done and back together, and then turn the car around and do the rear. And that all seemed well and good until I ran into one crucial deciding factor, and that was the hardware. There's all these unique pieces, and a lot of the nuts and bolts are rusty and not easily replaceable. So I came to the conclusion that I need to send in a batch of hardware and miscellaneous things to get re-zinc plated. And so it doesn't make sense to do a few things in one batch and then do a separate batch, because the plating company does everything all together. So it makes more sense to send everything at once. So all because of these miscellaneous pieces, it means I have to take apart the whole rear suspension now too and have the entire thing blown apart, which is a little more to handle. I don't have a lot of space to work on this, so it's a little more daunting to have the whole thing apart. But anyways, let's take apart the rear suspension. Okay, back wheels are off, car is raised up. Let's take a little look at what we have to take apart. There's these bars that connect the rear end to the chassis, so we can disconnect those from there, and probably could just leave them on there or take them off now, doesn't really matter. Sway bar, there's a rear sway bar that mounts to the body here, so I'll have to at least take those off. The shocks are actually really long. They go all the way up the top of the wheel arches, and you get to them from the trunk. Come all the way down here to the rear end. And the springs sit in these metal seats that are built into the rear axle. And my plan is, once I disconnect everything I need to, just lower down the whole rear axle with the jack gently, and it should take all the spring tension off. And those should just come out nicely, I hope. But I have to disconnect the brake lines, the parking brake cables, and deal with the torque tube. One of the first things I'll have to do is disconnect the drive shaft, but it kind of needs to be in there in order to plug the back of the transmission. I just put brand new fluid in there, so I don't want it all to come out. So I might just disconnect it from here and try to wire it in place so it kind of stays in there. But just behind there is the torque tube, which is this crazy tube that goes back to the rear axle, attaches with those 4 special bolts that have a serrated head on them, an 8mm serrated bit. So hopefully those don't break. But this torque tube cross member has bushings as well, so I got new ones for that. I'll have to disconnect the brake cables, and I think I might have to get the exhaust out of the way. I'm debating about whether to take the whole thing down as a unit with the torque tube and everything, or try to take the torque tube off separately. I might try to do the latter just to make it more manageable, but we'll see how it goes, I guess. First order of business was to clean up the serrated bolt heads so I could actually get the bit in there to grip. But then I realized I had to get the brake lines out of the way, so that was relatively straightforward, and I try to plug them off where I can just to keep some fluid in the system. Next, I marked the position of the parking brake cable adjuster just so when I put it back together, I should have a good idea of how much tension to put on it. Next, I worked on the drive shaft. The U-bolts have these little tabs that you have to bend out of the way. They keep the nuts from loosening. They're kind of broken, but I have some new ones when this goes back together, so that'll be good. Then I just wired the drive shaft in place to hold it inside the transmission, just to act as a plug so the fluid doesn't leak out. Then I could finally loosen these special bolts out and start to separate the torque tube from the rear axle. Next, I went to work on the torque tube cross member, just 1 bolt on either side. They're just a little bit tricky to get to. Then it became clear that I definitely needed to get the exhaust out of the way, so I went and loosened the head pipe. And then I could finally drop out the torque tube assembly. Oh, there it is. Finally. It's always more of a struggle than you think it's going to be. It's about as far as I'm going to get today, I think. As a new day began, the first thing I did was to disconnect these trailing arms, as well as the sway bar where it mounts to the body. Started off with the passenger side and then moved on to the driver's side. Of course, all along I have the axle supported with my jack. Next, on the panhard rod, there's this little cover over the nut on this side, so I pried it open and then was able to loosen the nut and pry off the rod from the axle. The other side was easy peasy. Next, I went into the trunk to disconnect the shocks from the top side first, and then it was easy to remove them from the bottom. Okay, I've disconnected all of the things that are holding the rear end in place except for the springs. Of course, I've had it supported by a jack underneath the whole time because I don't want it to suddenly explode out of the car. But now all that's left to do, in theory, is to gently let that pressure off, and it should be enough to let the springs down and everything will be just perfect, I hope. Here we go. Not exactly how I imagined it. So much for gentle. Don't forget to get those parking brake cables out of the way. Just had to take the drums off and pop these out. Aha! We have extraction. I don't know if this is even going to fit inside my shed. Let's bring it down the driveway and clean it up a bit. Okay, I finally got it to a more manageable spot here on blocks. It's getting kind of late in the day, but I'm going to give it a quick bath in some gunk, some really good heavy duty degreaser. But let's look at these old spring base rubbers. It's funny, the top ones were in really good shape and these are horrible. So all in all, I think it's good I got new ones. Take this one out too, same story. Anyway, duct tape up the yoke, so don't want to get water in there. Put a little cap over the brake line. I'll just gunk it real quick and hit it with the pressure washer. Oh, is that another factory tag there? That's cool. Probably about to get blasted away, unfortunately. I never knew that was there, though. Ugh. At this point in the day, I was exhausted, but I wanted to clean it up a little bit before I brought it inside. Of course, when I actually brought it inside, I ended up having to lift it and destroyed my back, and I've been going to the chiropractor for weeks. So get a friend to help you when you're lifting heavy objects. Okay, it's now time for one of the unfun things that I've been putting off, and that involves doing cleanup in this undercarriage area all back here. I also removed the gas tank just so I could clean this area as well as the tank itself. Might be a little excessive, but kind of wanted to do it. It's pretty grungy up in there. I don't think I'm going to repaint and re-undercoat everything. I think I'm mainly going to focus on beautifying these wheel arches that you actually see from the outside. For anyone wondering what kind of exhaust I had in it, there it is. Just custom job. Just the head pipe remains, which I might replace at this point. Get rid of the EGR. And there's the gas tank. No fancy plans other than to soak the whole undercarriage in degreaser and let it sit for a while, and then hit everything with the pressure washer, try to loosen up as much as I can, and then probably go back in by hand with brushes and rags and different degreaser and try to get it clean in there. Just dirty, just kind of wanting to clean things up. So these are the fuel lines. Plug them off so they don't get water in them. And this is just going to be a down and dirty situation. So this was really just the first of about 3 stages. I wanted to try to get as much stuff loose as I could with the gunk and the pressure washer. But once I had washed the entire thing down, of course it was wet everywhere, so I gave it some time to dry out and came back another day for stage 2. Stage 2, I ended up using some crud cutter, which I really like because it's a non-toxic degreaser but still really powerful. I just went in there by hand with a rag, and I had a bucket to rinse out the rag. But this ended up working out really well. You have to manually clean things sometimes. Pressure washer's not enough. As I kept cleaning, I was actually amazed at how good a condition this car is in. I was expecting it to be all surface rusty and ugly under there, but in fact most of the original factory coating was there and it looked fantastic. So as much of a pain in the butt as it was to crawl under there and clean everything by hand, I was actually very gratified by the condition of the car. Finally, I wanted to wash away the remaining grime because the rag I was using was filthy. So I rinsed everything down with some hot water mixed with Dawn dish soap and let that soak in for a bit before one last pass with the pressure washer. Well, it's a couple days later. All that cleaning really wore me out. It was hard work, but it really paid off. I am in disbelief at what I found under here. This thing is in incredible condition. Look at this. This thing's from 1973, and this is the factory bottom coating on the car. I thought this was all going to be surface rust, but underneath that grime, it's pretty much pristine. I can't believe it. There's almost no rust whatsoever. So I don't need to really do anything with these inner areas, especially. You can see a bit of the original silver paint. This car was silver from the factory. You can see some of the undercoating overspray. So really the only areas I think I need to touch up are these wheel wells, where you can see these big patches of missing undercoating. I want to touch that up, make it pretty. And there's some yellow overspray here and there. Really just need to address sort of the outer areas that you can see. So a little black touch-up paint, a little undercoating, and this thing's gonna be pristine. Yeah, it's also this kind of stuff on the outer edges that I'd like to clean up or hide a little bit with just a little squirt of black paint. All that stuff makes a difference when you look at the car from the side. Time for another narrated time lapse. I masked off the wheel arches with some wide tape, as well as the rubber bump stops that I didn't want to remove nor get overspray on. And basically went to town after I had scuffed and cleaned all these areas. Took my undercoating and a piece of cardboard to avoid overspray, and was able to get a nice coat on these wheel arches. I didn't film the second coat or the black detail painting, but let's see how it turned out. Okay, fast forward, it's a couple days later and I did a second coat of the undercoating, as well as did some black detail painting with some flat black rust converting paint. So anywhere where there was a little bit of surface rust, it should have helped treat it. And it also gives everything a nice uniform dark look. So when you look at the car from the side, you won't see any of that ugly overspray or issues that we saw before. So it looks nice and clean. I cleaned up some of these mounting places where some of the suspension arms are going to go. This is the time to do it. Here's the passenger side. Nice and clean as well. I didn't go all the way in because the gas tank is going to be there, and figured I'd leave something original. But yeah, in general, looks a lot nicer to have these sides and inner wheel wells all cleaned up. Okay, at long last, all of the rear suspension components are out of the car. The car is all cleaned up underneath. So we've reached a bit of a turning point because now the car is ready for parts to go back into it. The only problem is all those parts are still dirty and crusty and I need to clean them up. I need to remove the old bushings, repaint things, install the new bushings. And there's some issues with the new bushings, the polyurethane aftermarket stuff. So I'm going to have to make some modifications to some things. I'm also going to have to save and reuse some of my old inner metal sleeves from some of the original bushings. So that's going to be a whole nother video just dealing with the components. But man, I'm looking forward to things going back together and being all clean and pretty. Not to mention driving this car again for the first time and seeing how it handles. So stay tuned for the rest of this project. Think about subscribing if you want to see where this goes. But yeah, saga continues. See you next time.